is running now. And can you give me short feedback whether you all see my screen nicely?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, yeah, so yesterday I sent around a few files. I would like to go a little bit into more advanced model building techniques now with Isolde, which will hopefully at the end of the session enable you to be much faster and also hopefully more confident. For this I would like to use the same model essentially and the same map. So first of all I would like to actually ask you to fire up this very same model, which is this 6v20 dirk.pdb. Please use this one because I'm aiming on using the deletion that I actually placed in this model. Yeah, same thing, open it together with the map, fire up Isolde and connect the map to the model. This is done by associate real space map with current model. And in the next step, I will just change the settings to my personal preferences, which is white background, and then I just display the surface rather than a mesh, and I increase the spotlight radius to see more of the map in the field of view. Okay, I will wait maybe a couple of seconds for you to follow up on this. Meanwhile, what I will do in my session is I will type select, and the shortcut is SEL, tilde proteins to select everything that is not a protein, and then I will type delete, DEL, space SEL for select to delete all the waters, and you will see that they all disappear. That will make it a bit easier to navigate. Okay, so what are we going to do today? So first thing I thought we could do actually is, in terms of model building, you know that we have one stretch of amino acids that I deleted. And last time, I guess, Katalin showed us that there is actually a new command available which can now be used to add residues. Previously that was not the case. So what I'm doing now is I'm basically going to that folder in which I saved the scripts that we are going to use today. So there's 3 of them, 1, 2, 3, and I wanted to start with the first one. If you open this, you can take these commands and we're going to use them now. First of all, what I actually wanted to do is I wanted to show you how you can now do model building in a bit more advanced way. For doing this, we would like to go to the C terminus of chain that is labeled with the letter B. And for this, we go to the very end, and if I'm not mistaken, this is 340 and 4. So it's center view, space /B, and then we have a double dot and 344 for the terminal residue, and here it is, it's a proline. So this is the very C terminus, not modeled correctly, but this is just a nasty detail because there is one oxygen missing if it would be the real C terminus, but it doesn't matter for now. What we want to do now is basically I just wanted to show you how you can extend this chain, and to do so we have this, I generated this little script, and one of the commands that is actually needed to do this is the command that is written here first. It's Isolde add AA for amino acid, then the number in 3-letter code for the residue you want to add, and the position to which it should be connected. And Isolde by itself realizes that there's already an N-terminal addition to this residue, so it will automatically add it to the C-terminus. So what I have done here then now is I extended this script essentially in a way that once Isolde has added the residue C-terminal to the residue that is shown here, to this proline, I tell Isolde it should select the new residue that has been modeled and add the tryptophan to this residue. Then to select the tryptophan, build an isoleucine, and so on and so forth. And with this script, if we just copy everything of it and put it into the command line and type enter, what we ideally should get is something like this. So now basically by just copy pasting this script, which of course is handwritten, and one needs to adapt this to the sequence that you actually want to build, obviously, you can add a number of residues at once, which makes the model building process much faster. Previously it was a bit more work because the command wasn't implemented and wasn't so easy, but this is now very convenient. Okay. This of course is just an example how the script works. Now we go into the real example, and for this I actually prepared a second script. So you now know the command, how it works in general, and I will close this one and I will just open the second script, which is named To and Building. It's a bit more complicated and I will try to guide you through this. So first of all, I would like to ask you to go to the position 296 in chain A. For this you can say center view, and then you go to /A296. And you will find that at this position, this is exactly where we left off last time in the neighborhood, so end terminal of this alanine residue. You will find the tryptophan which has been modeled with the wrong rotamer. Pretty obviously. And what I did here is, of course, this is what I engineered. This was modeled correctly before, but I deleted a stretch of 10 amino acids, and we can basically follow this chain, how it runs through the protein with its density. Some really, let's say, marker residues are here, which is a tyrosine here. You can start seeing the whole, especially if you play around a little bit with the threshold. You see a phenylalanine here, so some really nice marker residues, and it continues just to this end terminus. And this is also indicated by the dashed line, which is in ChimeraX, highlighting a pseudo bond. Okay, going back to 296 and to this position where we actually want to build in the middle of a protein. So in the script, I listed first the sequence that needs to be built, and I extracted this from UniProt, from the identifier that I sent along. And one of the things that you can start using regularly is add-h. If you don't do this, the software will ask you before you run a simulation, but it's if you get used to it, things will be a bit faster. Add-h just adds hydrogen atoms to all residues which don't have any. And this is needed for the simulation to run because the hydrogens are needed to calculate the distance between residues. So if you do this, it will automatically do this up front and you can save a bit of time. You see now here that the nitrogen atom has received its hydrogen bond in the peptide backbone, but also, for example, here the nitrogen and tryptophan side chain or the lysine. Okay. So what we now want to do is basically we want to add this sequence, and I already prepared this for you. So what we're going to do is we select the residue 296, which is now here the C terminus. If you hover over it, you see that this is chain A, alanine at position 296. And the script starts with selection of this very residue and then addition of a leucine residue to this residue. And like this, I go through the entire chain, adding basically the sequence up here. And if I do this, copy paste basically into the command line, you will see that out of a sudden all the residues, just as before, appear magically. But what you will also notice, and this is now a little bit of a special situation that you will not face in programs like Qt, because Isolde is using a molecular dynamics simulation, and this is based on a minimizer function, so to speak. If residues are getting too close, such as right in the center here, the minimizer sometimes has issues to start the simulation because the atoms are clashing, or in other words, they're occupying the same position in 3D space. And this typically happens if you add a lot of residues at once in a region where already a model has been built. So this can be a bit tricky, but there is a workaround to make this work very nicely. And this is the second part of this script, which is I'm basically telling Isolde to ignore all the residues in chain A that are not the ones that I just built. And this is done with the command Isolde space ignore space, and then you give the residue range that you want to do. In this case, it's starting from 1 to 294, and then continuing from 307 to 500. And if I do this, you will see that the command has been applied, and that Isolde gives you in the log file report the notification that Isolde is currently ignoring 331 residues in model 1.2. But in the viewing field, nothing is changing yet. Okay, next step in this protocol essentially is to select the residues that you want to now put into their correct density. And for this I added this selection command of the residues 295 to 36. And if I select them all, I can actually start a local simulation for these residues. I lower the temperature a little bit so things aren't moving that fast. And I go into play mode, so the simulation starts, and what you then should see is that all the residues that you basically ignored will turn black. So they're not moving because the simulation is now ignoring them. And like this, you now have also the freedom to basically move around the new build stuff freely, even if there is stuff in the environment, without many problems. If you don't do this, then eventually the simulation will not start, but will give you an error message that there are too many clashes that Isolde cannot resolve, and as a consequence you cannot continue. So this is really vital if you want to build. Sometimes when you do this, a new simulation, the map will partially disappear. To resolve this issue, you just go into the spotlight radius and re-enter the number, and the map will reappear. You see this here that I did this clipper spotlight radius 30, although it was 30 before. Okay, now the simulation is running, and we can basically go and manually place the sequence or the residues where they belong. And of course for this you need to play around a little bit with the model, and you navigate through the model and you try to place things according to the density, which can be done by hand. So I'm just dragging with my mouse here, trying to move the things into the correct place. And of course, yeah, yes?
It's not working on my computer. Is this a version thing, or because it's not recognizing any of the commands that you gave this add command?
Are you having the latest version of Isolde on your computer?
Maybe not. That's why I'm asking, is this new?
This is in the latest version, Isolde 1.2.2, that works together with ChimeraX 1.25.
Okay, I'll have a look.
I mean, maybe download it now. I will reiterate this with a slightly different example later. So maybe you want to drop out now and reinstall the new version.
Yep.
And then you can join in later. But I'm also recording this session, and I can provide the video to you later as well, and you can go through it again. Yes, and like this now we can basically take all these residues and put them into their densities, and I think this of course I think depends a little bit on experience to make this now maybe as quick as I'm doing it, but in general this is what it is. So two new functions that I would like to introduce, and this is basically now more or less in the correct spot. Two new functions that can make your life a little bit easier when doing this for the first time, because if you don't really know where things are going to be placed and you feel a bit unsecure, what you can do is, for example, I now choose this tyrosine residue, which I moved into the correct density, but you can choose whatever residue you want in your simulation now. And I control click on one of the atoms that I would actually like to select, and in this case it's now the CB atom of this tyrosine residue in 301. And if I go to the rebuild function, what you see down here are basically tools that allow you to fix atoms during the simulation. So if I click on this one here, it restrains the selected atom to its current position, and what you see is this little marker that pops up, And you can even give it a weight, so how strong this restraint should now pull. And you can see that when I try to move the residue, this atom will be moved back into its position, whereas the others are still free to move. So if you really want to fix something, you can choose 2 or more points, and now I cannot move this residue out of its density anymore because the restraints will pull it back to where I think it belongs. So if you're trying to fix longer areas all at once, you can, once you're satisfied with a certain residue and the fit into its map, you can fix the residue like this and continue building until you have the entire sequence matching its density. And to remove this, you can, for example, click Control and make like a little box with a mouse that selects all the residues within this box, and you click on this X here, and that will just remove these restraints. Another way of forcing atoms into a certain position, for example, is I move now this tyrosine out of its density, and I roughly know that this atom which I mark here now, which is the oxygen of this tyrosine residue, should be somewhere positioned at the tip of this tyrosine density. So what I can do is I can actually take this pivot here and move it to the position where I think this oxygen should be placed. Something like this, roughly. And then I use the second option, which is move the atom that I marked to the pivot point, essentially, or restrain it to the position of the pivot point. Again, this can be done with a weight. If I do this, it will move there. And once I release and the density is stable enough, it will also stay there. So that, like this, you can basically bring into their densities many residues, even over longer stretches. Finally, what we want to do here now is also to connect these chains. So I will now stop and save. So I can, for example, click on the green stop sign down here. This will stop the simulation and will save the current coordinate file. And you see that now the pseudobond is pretty small and they are disconnected. To connect those two, we need to basically select the atoms that contribute to the peptide bond. And for this, I provided this command here. And this, what it does exactly this. It selects residue in chain A, 306, and of this residue, only the nitrogen. And the second selection is of the residue that is next to it, and here it only selects the carbon. And if I do this, you will see that the selection will actually just include this C atom of the C terminus and the nitrogen of the N terminus. And these are the two that need to come together to form a peptide bond. And now to connect them, Isolde has an internal function which is Isolde model building make bond. And if you click on that, you will see that they will be fused. And now you can basically start a local simulation. It will update, and you see that the bond is not ideal. So this is the sign for that the geometry of the bond is not okay and should be fixed. But it will automatically be fixed the moment you start the simulation. And once you have done this, maybe we can do a little checkup on the sequence that we just built by going through it. We can discuss maybe some sidechain orientations, but essentially you have achieved the task, and I will briefly maybe reiterate what we can do with this tryptophan here. This is not in its right position. I think this is obvious. So we can either touch it and move it into its position, which sometimes can be a bit challenging, because when you move things in the simulation, you will see this up here with this proline. Since two atoms cannot occupy the same space, the moment you move one of them, the other one will react, and you don't want other areas to move out of their density eventually. So you may use the Isolde ignore command, but you can also be carefully dragging if you want to do so, or you can use the commands that are basically no, I cannot select for whatever reason. No, I can. You can use the commands that are listed here. So the upper ones are for changing the backbone geometry. So this is Hammerhandran stats. And the lower ones are for changing sidechain configuration or rotamers. And you can see I can cycle through them. None of them is the correct one that I actually need for this specific purpose, and this is why also the residue properties that are shown here, the rotamer belongs to the group M-90, and you can see that this is a clear rotamer outlier, but it's very well covered by the density, so it's all fine to model it like this. This is a very well represented by density rotamer outlier in this model. Okay, so this is the second script essentially. Now we have basically built this part, and now I don't know, Linda, how advanced are you with reinstalling? Linda?
Yes, it's installing Isolde now.
Okay, then I can already tell you that please close now the model and reopen the original file so that we get back the original starting coordinates, which is actually lacking the sequence that we just built. I open the map again, connect the map and change the representation style. Again, I select everything that is not a protein and delete it, so waters are not so much disturbing the view. And maybe Linda, you can give me a go.
Almost.
And meanwhile, I will just go into the validate tab. Here you can again see the backbone geometry of certain residues, which ones are outliers. For example, this one here could be eventually modeled better. And when you click on this residue, you will see you will jump to the according to the sequence belonging to it. You will notice that in some areas the density is not as nice as it used to be in the core. This is because this is an area that belongs to the periphery, and typically there the density is a bit worse, but in this map it's still really good. And the reason why this is an outlier is maybe because what you can see here already is that the two oxygen atoms of the peptide backbone are more or less pointing in similar directions. And this is typically not the case in protein structures. It's typically the opposite configuration, which is preferred, with one exception, and that can be proline. And maybe with very, very, very rare cases in which you have such a backbone configuration. And this is what in the rebuild tab you have this configuration that you can change from cis to trans. So I will try to fix this. Now you see what I mentioned in the beginning, that I haven't added any hydrogen, so it's complaining. And when I click OK, it will basically do this for me.
I have it now.
Okay, cool. Now there are the hydrogens. I restart a local simulation on this residue, and I can try to improve or see whether I can actually improve it. Sometimes this happens automatically just by simulating to improve the local geometry, and this is already much better. But we could, for example, select the C alpha atom and just also try to play around with these bonds, and you see this is obviously making it worse. Okay. Good. Then I would like to send you back to the position where we are going to model. And for this, I would now use script number 3. This is now, I would say, the most advanced version of this script. So we go to the same position, which is residue 296 in chain A, with center view A296. And we will be again ending up in the position that needs to be modeled. Linda, if you want to delete waters, you can type select everything. So select tilde protein and then delete space selection, and you will get rid of all the waters that may be in the way now. Okay, so what we do essentially is very similar. We first add these residues as we did before by copy-pasting the commands, and we get into the very same situation. What we also do is we will ignore the environment. So I say Isolde ignore, and the residues basically before and after. then we get this command here in the log that it has been applied. Nothing will change in your view. And now we do something different to what we've been doing before. And this is we're trying to apply restraints because we are even more lazy than before. And this we can do because this structure here actually contains 4 copies of the same molecule, and they are present already in one of the other copies or in all 3 of them. I'm not saying this is the typical flow through when you are building de novo into a map, but you could, for example, envision that you are modeling a monomer like ESCV or 24 subunits like we have in the type 3 secretion system, and you're pretty satisfied with your model and you assemble all the 24 subunits, let's say, by copy pasting. But then eventually you spot one problematic area once you have assembled everything, and now you want to change this in all the 24 of them. So you can either change it in one and copy paste again, or you can use what I'm doing now. And to apply restraints, there are 2 different commands that we're going to use. One of them is aiming on the backbone configuration, so Hamburg angles. The other one is aiming on the sidechain configuration, which is rotamers. The 2 commands are basically written here. So what the 2 commands say is Isolde restrain the distances, which is the Hamburg angles, so to speak. Or not only Hamburg angles, but it's also taking into consideration the distances between atoms. And what it should restrain is basically the selection or the residues that we just built, so from 295 to 306. And as a template, it should take the same residue range, but from chain number B. So if we take that command and we put it into the command line and type enter, we will see that these restraints appear. And you can now see that some of them are very thick and green, and they will be pulling a lot. And this is for the reason that in the template structure they are much closer. Others are thinner, so they are already in a fairly similar distance compared to the template. And others are purple, so they probably are already in the correct distance, but it certainly indicates that these restraints will not pull. And you will see now that they appear all over the place in the entire sequence that we just marked. Likewise, we are going to use torsion restraints, and they work the same. It's the second command where we say Isolde restrain torsions, again in the same sequence in chain A, but this time we use template, and the command is template residues instead of atoms. And we say as a template we want to use again the chain B. We could also use chain C or D, whatever we like. And we have to provide this additional command, which is angle range 180, and this is to allow residues to really flip from one side to the other side in the simulation. So I also take this very command and type it down here. And you will see now that all the side chains, they will get these little circles surrounding them. And this is basically saying that there is now a certain rotamer conformation associated. Once you start the simulation, it will force it into this rotamer conformation, regardless what the map is saying. So, and this is now applied to all these side chains. Now I will zoom out a little bit or go a bit into the distance. You will see that the density where this stuff belongs is down here. Now from this side.
Dirk, sorry.
Yeah?
How do I zoom in? I always see the whole structure.
On my computer I can do this with the mouse wheel. Do you have a mouse wheel?
Ah, just the mouse wheel, yeah, okay.
And then to rotate, you keep the left mouse button clicked down. So the way, I mean, sometimes this can be looking a bit different depending on how Isolde placed these new residues. In my case, now you see that the density where they belong is actually down here, and it has placed them up here, which is now nicely visible because you see the restraints being applied. So what I do next is I actually want to start a simulation of these residues. So I select the corresponding residues, and I will start the simulation, and maybe I can increase a bit the field of view. And what you can hopefully appreciate now is first things will turn black in the environment because residues have been ignored. You also see that the map again disappears. I think this is I don't want to say a bug, but we need to recall the spotlight here. And then you see that something has already happened to the model. And I can bring this up and repeat by saying, okay, go back to the last saved checkpoint without stopping the simulation. So we will return to the situation before the simulation started, and the simulation will directly run again. And by doing this, you basically iterate between starting and the starting coordinates and what the simulation will now do to these new residues that are being simulated when the restraints are being applied. And you will see that the side chains are turning around, they are brought in a certain conformation, that the restraints are pulling, you see some thick lines. And this is actually already what we want to have, because what we then need to only do is we basically tuck these residues, and we can either do this with the button down here. If you click on this one, all the residues that are currently selected will be moved as a whole. But since there are restraints applied that keep them in their position anyway, you can also just basically drag one of these residues and try to move it down. And when you've done this, you're essentially done with the model building, except for some local fixes. And I repeat this now. I go back to the starting coordinates. So we'll first apply the restraints in the simulation. And if I then drag it into the position where it belongs, you will see that it will automatically fall into its density. And this is because the conformation of this part of the molecule of these chains is highly similar to the other copies. So in fact, by copy pasting these restraints, I can apply the same conformation that I had here. Now we can of course discuss if you have a symmetry applied, whether this is then the right way to do, or if you have a C1 reconstruction and you have 24 subunits, you may want to go into all of them locally and see whether there's local differences, which is what I anyway would recommend. As a last step of this protocol, what I would do, and this is what I also listed here, is I have two commands that actually cause these distances and torsion restraints to release. And you can copy them both and paste them simultaneously, and you will see then that they will release, and then the residues have the freedom to move into the density as the density is. And you will... Sorry? Okay.
No, I'm fine, sorry.
Okay. And then the last remaining thing to actually do is again to fix this connection here, which I explained in the video before. And I don't know whether I have the copy. Sorry?
Is there a way to actually make it show a little bit more density when you're doing a simulation? When the chain is outside of the density, sometimes you don't see it. Is there a way to...
Yes, so so I changed the spotlight radius to roughly 30. I mean, this depends a little bit on the computer power that you're having. So the bigger the spotlight radius, the slower the simulation. So you can actually improve performance by changing here to simulation fidelity to quick, and to lower the spotlight radius to 5. But if you, for example, do this, of course, you only see very little. So I increased it to 30. But if you start the simulation, it will always apply a spotlight radius around the simulated residues. So you can show the entire map, like spotlight 500, if your computer allows this. Right? So you now realize that also the computer here starts getting slower. But if I now really start a simulation in this local area, what will happen is the spotlight radius automatically adjusts to the residues that are being mobilized. And you can restore this by clicking again on the spotlight radius.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And call it up again. It takes now a second because I overdid it a bit with 500. So maybe I go just back to 50. And then you see it again. And then of course there's also the threshold that you can change that helps you a bit to adjust to the local area. Yes. Okay, and with this, basically, I think you are free to basically delete more or less the entire model of one of the copies. except for maybe a very prominent residue pair somewhere in the center, like a tyrosine coupled to something else, and start building de novo the entire protein of one of the copies, essentially yourself, I would say. I've seen Biao doing this in the last days here. Must say I'm very happy to see that he succeeded actually building one of the copies de novo to very high quality already. So I think with the tools that you have at hand now, you can certainly start getting into model building with this high resolution map. And this is what I would actually highly recommend to do for now, to practice the eye and the density to build into a map in which the sidechain density is very, very clear, because that will help you to judge later densities that are not that, let's say, nicely resolving the sidechain residues in your structure. And with this, I think we can stop for today. And in the next sessions, I would then try to go into dynamic fitting procedures.
Okay, dear.